I'm Heather Osborne, Director of Wealth Planning at Baird.
And I'm Tim Steffen, Director of Advanced Planning. It's our pleasure to introduce our colleagues Jason Trennert and Dan Clifton from Strategas.
Jason and Dan are going to provide their insights into the financial markets, the economy, and fiscal policy for 2024, and how these things might be influenced by the upcoming election.
And then Heather and I will be back to talk about some tax and wealth planning considerations you can take with you into the new year.
Hi everyone, this is Jason Trennert. I am the chairman of Strategas, which is Baird's institutional strategy arm. And we thought it might be a good idea for us to go through some basic big picture thoughts on the year ahead for the markets and for the economy.
What are your odds for a recession in 2024?
We're actually using odds of 1 in 2, about 50%. Now that might sound kind of a rather anodyne type of answer, but in a typical year, it's only about 15%. We think the odds are still elevated because the yield curve, the difference between long-term interest rates and short-term interest rates, is inverted because money growth is slowing and corporate profits are also under pressure. Having said that, I'm not so sure it's going to be, if we do get a recession, it will be particularly deep, and that's largely because it's an election year and we are running quite extensive budget deficits to ease the pain. So chances of recession are elevated as versus what they would be normally, but the chances of a deep recession, in our opinion, are actually pretty low.
What would that mean for the stock market?
Well, I think what this means for the stock market is that investors very much want to stay with high quality companies that have an ability to generate cash and earnings without being reliant upon the kindness of strangers for their capital needs. During the period of 2009 through 2021, the Fed had a program called quantitative easing, which is kind of a fancy term for money printing, or pretty close, in which interest rates were kept artificially low. That allowed a lot of marginal companies to get funding and led to a very stable economy, but inflation has changed all of that, and the Fed now has switched to something called quantitative tightening. That's a fancy term for just tightening monetary conditions. In the end, that means that better companies are going to have a better access to capital and a cheaper cost of capital. It also means that weaker companies may not make it or may need to be consolidated into other companies in order to survive. So we still are very much of the view that the name of the game is buying high quality companies that generate their own cash flows and profits.
What's something underreported or underdiscussed?
Well, I believe, and this will fit in well with some of the points that you'll hear from Dan Clifton, but I think one of the things that's not being discussed enough is the fact that we are running budget deficits that are roughly 6% of GDP at a period of time of full employment. That is extremely unusual in peacetime. It's actually never happened in peacetime. With an unemployment rate that's anything less than 7%. So that creates its own issues. There is a chance that even if inflation declines next year, that interest rates stay high simply because the federal government has to issue a lot more debt. There'll be a lot more supply of debt on the market. Next year is also an election year, of course, and the party in power, Democrat or Republican, generally tends to grease the skids for their own re-election by spending more money than they have, and so that is a bipartisan affliction or practice, and we would not be surprised if that's very much the case in 2024. Well, thank you all for your time today. I'm going to pass the baton on to our Washington guru, Dan Clifton. Obviously, next year's an election year, so it's going to be exciting for everyone concerned, and certainly the election is going to cast a long shadow over both the economy and the markets. So without further ado, let me introduce Dan Clifton.
What is the global political environment for 2024, and how might it impact the fiscal policy outlook?
In 2024, about 40% of the world's economy will be voting for a new president or head of leader of their country. This is on the high end of the range of the amount of elections that you usually get into an election. And what we've been noticing is that in elections where you have slower economic growth, incumbents have been losing in the second half of 2023. And so as these elections ramp up in 2024, there's going to be a lot of pressure to increase fiscal policy or to not have as tight of monetary policy. We're already seeing this in the United States. You now have a Treasury Department that is funding the government on the short end of the Treasury curve, that is minimizing any type of liquidity drain. You're also starting to see expectations building in for 2024 of monetary policy becoming a bit easier. Additionally, there's going to be efforts in Congress to look at doing a bipartisan tax bill sometime in early 2024. This would include an expansion of the child tax credit and resumption of some business deductions that have already expired. While that's not guaranteed to happen, the president also has some other levers that are available to him. We'll be seeing the implementation of the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act. And you can also possibly see a resumption of business tax credits through the Employee Retention Tax Credit and a student loan tax cut that's scheduled to come into effect on July 1st, 2024. So this policymakers have some tools available to them, even if polarization starts to block out any meaningful new legislative ideas in 2024.
How does the U.S. stock market typically act in a presidential election year?
Surprisingly, presidential election years have been very good for stocks. I know there's a tendency amongst investors to get worried about the policy uncertainty that's going to creep up into the year. And by the way, it will creep up. But from a stock market perspective, it really hasn't had much of an impact. Going back to 1952, the stock market has only declined 3 times in a presidential re-election year. That was 1960, 2000, and 2008. What's interesting about that is those are open presidential election years, a year where there was no incumbent president. When you look at it, when there is an incumbent president running for re-election, just as like we see for 2024, the S&P 500 has not declined since 1948 in that type of environment. We believe that that happens because presidents like to get re-elected. They understand that the economy has the most outsized impact on their re-election. They seek to prime the pump ahead of the election, and stocks have responded accordingly. In fact, every president that has avoided a recession 2 years before their re-election has gone on to win re-election, and every president who had a recession went on to lose re-election. So it's very critical for the incumbent to avoid a recession, and they are likely to use all the tools available to them. And not coincidentally, stocks have responded to that, and by extension, voters generally respond to that as well. I can't thank you enough for your time today. And as we head into the election year in 2024, Strategos will make sure to keep you updated on any investment, economic, and political events as they happen. We want to wish everybody good luck in 2024.